Well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. My name is Ibrahim Musa. I am one of the three co-directors of Contending Modernities. As many of you know, Contending Modernities is a program started by Dean Scott Appleby that is a interdisciplinary effort to generate new knowledge and greater understanding of the ways in which religious traditions and secular forces interact in the modern world. In its first phase, Contending Modernities explored how Islam and Catholicism have understood, accommodated, altered, and resisted the radical transformation that have characterized the modern world. As it has grown, the initiative has engaged other discursive traditions and expanded its geographic focus to include projects in Indonesia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and introduced a thematic focus on decoloniality. My other co-directors is, as I mentioned, Dean Scott Appleby and Atalia Omer. Contending Modernities involves dozens of scholars, public intellectuals, and religious and secular leaders from universities and research institutes around the world. And we are absolutely delighted that Father Katongole, our honoree and whose book we are celebrating here today, is part of that team in Contending Modernities. Today I have an easy task, but an important task. I want everybody to enjoy themselves, especially the speakers and the honoree, but within the 15 minutes they've been allocated. They can have a great time. So let me introduce the honoree and the author of today's book, this wonderful book called Who Are My People? Father Emmanuel Katongole is Professor of Theology and Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame in the Brock Institute School and Theology Department. His focus is on politics and violence in Africa, theology of reconciliation and Catholicism in the global South. He's the author of books on the Christian social imagination, the crisis of faith following the genocide in Rwanda, and some of those themes reverberate through this book, and Christian approaches to justice, peace, and reconciliation. His most recent books are, of course, Born from Lament on the Theology and Politics of Hope in Africa, published by Erdmans in 2017, The Journey of Reconciliation, Groaning for a New Creation of Africa, August 27. And Professor Katongole obviously coordinates an interdisciplinary working group within Contending Modernities Research Initiative, which investigates how religious and secular forces complete or collaborate in shaping new modes of authority, community, and identity within the context of nation-state modalities in Africa. Father Katongole is a Catholic priest ordained by the Archdiocese of Kampala, Uganda. And I must say that my colleague has also coordinated a wonderful team, and several of his team's authors' books are now being published through the University of Notre Dame. We are honored here today by three colleagues who will also comment on this book. One is, first speaker after Father Katongole will be Cecilia Lynch, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. Her research, writing, and teaching focuses on interrelated themes of religion, secularism, humanitarianism, ethics, and international relations, broadly conceived, and including its racial and gendered character. That's very important. Her work on humanitarianism and religion has taken her across Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Europe and the Middle East, with attention to how people reconcile their various religious traditions and teachings, as well as other kinds of commitments, and how we deal with legacies of colonialism, missionizing, paternalism, and racism. Her most recent work is Wrestling with God, Ethical Precarity in Christianity and International Relations, Cambridge University 2020. And Cecilia is a long and standing friend with Contending Modernities. Well, welcome, Cecilia. Our second commentator is Todd Whitmore. Professor Todd Whitmore is Associate Professor of Theology in Notre Dame's Theology Department. Todd uses ethnographic methods to raise theological questions. From 2005 to 13, This work of his took him to war and post-conflict zones in northern Uganda and South Sudan, leading to his book Imitating Christ in Magwi, an anthropological theology that was published in 2018. During his time in Uganda, he co-founded a non-profit grounded in Catholic social teaching that combined agricultural training and peace building. Welcome, Todd. Thank you for your presence here today. Our third speaker is Jason Springs. Jason is a professor of religion, ethics, and peace studies in the Keough School. He's I must mention this, and in the Kroc Institute. His research and teaching integrate religious ethics with moral philosophy, political and social theories with specific attention to modern European and North American contexts. Jason is particularly interested in ethical, philosophical, and theological dimensions of restorative justice, attending specifically to the potential to intervene in racialized and class dimensions of the US prison industrial complex. He works on questions of structural and cultural violence, conceptions of religious toleration, and challenges posed by religious pluralism for transforming conflict. Islamophobia in Europe and North America is among the foci, democratic theories and practices, frameworks of peace building, and in his latest book, Healthy Conflict in Contemporary American Society, From Enemy to Adversary, Jason examines seemingly intractable episodes of religious intolerance and moral conflict across contemporary US and European public. Thank you for being here today, Jason. I look forward to your comments. So, Father Katongole, you will have the first word. And as you say in your book, and I like this wonderful expression that you have, that you said that, you know, you follow the kind of storytelling that blends aesthetics and empiricism in an effort to capture the complexity, dynamics, and subtlety of human experience in organizational life. Then you tell us something else. You also say a distinctive element that the portraitists need to have is not simply to listening to a story, but listening for a story. I'm going to sit down and listen for a story.
Well, thank you very much, Ibrahim, for your kind words of introduction. And I thank you and the other co-directors of the Containing Modernities, Natalia Ome and Professor Scott Appleby. Really, Containing Modernities and you all have supported my scholarship and my work. So thank you for the words of affirmation. I'm glad that you're going to be not only listening to the story, but also listening for a story. I would like also to thank Dania, the program manager for Containing Modernities, for the ways in which you have supported me throughout my time here, my research, but also for organizing this book launch. Thank you for your I'm very grateful for the various units that I'm affiliated with that have hosted this event, the Kroc Institute, the Theology Department, the Center for Social Concerns, the Kellogg Institute, the Ansari Institute, the Notre Dame Press, all that have contributed to hosting this event. And to all my colleagues in the Authority, Community, and Identity Research Focus of the Containing Modernities, of which Cecilia is a member, I want to thank them all that we have learned from one another through various meetings and engagements, and I've really learned a lot from you all. And thank you, Cecilia, for coming all the way from California, from another country. California, for many of us here, sounds like another country. So we're grateful that you came abroad, from abroad to be here with us this afternoon. I thank you, my colleagues, Todd and Jason, for being here. You know how much I think highly of your work, and I'm trying to mimic and imitate some of the work that you are doing. So your being here is really indeed a great honor. I very much look forward to the comments, the questions, the issues that you are going to raise as you took time to read the book, for which I'm very, very grateful. I would like to welcome in a special way somebody in our midst here, that is my brother, Joseph Kakoza, who traveled all the way from Uganda. He heard that the title of the book was "Who Are My People?" and said, "Really? Okay, I need to be there then." So thank you for coming. And to you all, my dear friends and colleagues and students, it is indeed a great joy and honor for me to be here and to see you this afternoon. I very much look forward to the interaction after the discussion, the reception, but also to our ongoing friendship. You all are the answer to the question in the book titled, "Who are my people?" You are my people. I will leave it to the panelists to get into the work, the book and the discussion. And since you all are going to be buying and reading the book, I don't want to spoil your reading, so I'm not going to give away the plot or the details of the book. But I would like, by way of providing some kind of signposts, perhaps make a few 4 observations, broad observations about the book. The first one is why I wrote the book. It has been slow in coming, this book. It goes back to 1994. I was a graduate student at Louvain in Belgium. Spring 1994, genocide in Rwanda. Finished watching the news. We've been watching the news as it was showing bodies of Rwandans and rivers and churches and streets, and we are all silent. As we left the TV room, one colleague, another PhD candidate from another continent, turned to me and said, "Why is it that you Africans always kill your own people?" Of course, I reacted and said, "What do you mean, my people? Yeah, why do you Africans kill fellow Africans?" The question has bothered me, has haunted me for all these years. And "Who are my people?" is an attempt to respond to that question, to the extent that one can respond to such a question. The question, first of all, is a question about identity. What does it mean to be African? What does it mean to have other Africans as my fellow Africans? What do I share with other Africans that make them my people more than any other people? Is it race? Is it the color of my skin? Is it biology? Is it history? Is it geography? Or is it culture that makes me naturally, and thus without effort, allied to other Africans more than I can be to any other people? How does this identity relate to other identities that I might have? These are the kind of questions that I engage in. Who are my people? I do not engage these questions from a purely theoretical point of view. I grapple with my own identity as an African and as a Christian, with the goal of inviting the reader on a similar journey of exploring their own multiple and overlapping forms of identity and belonging. The second issue, of course, the question raises, why do you kill your own people, is the question of the recurrent patterns of violence on the African continent. In Who Are My People, I explore the connection between identity and violence on the African continent. I specifically studied 3 forms of violence: ethnic violence, religious violence, and ecological violence on the African continent, in order to investigate the complex connections between identity and violence within those forms of violence. That is why I wrote the book. Secondly, how did I write the book? Of course, there is the containing modernities story and the support from containing modernities. More than the support, the urging, I would say even the pressing, especially of the then director of the containing modernities, Scott Akopi, that you have to write this book. But from the very start, I had an assumption that the violence that we see in Africa, there is something distinctly modern about that violence. In fact, even what usually passes under the label of ethnic violence is not ancient, tribal, primitive violence. It is a very modern phenomenon that reflects the unsettled questions of belonging and access to the social, political, and economic and cultural institutions of modern Africa. To understand the crisis of belonging, one has to trace it to a story, the foundational story of Africa's modernity, by which Africa is at once rejected. There is nothing good about Africa, and yet at the same time incorporated into the processes of Western modernity as the beneficiary of the Western project of colonization, of civilization, development, and pacification. That is the story that invented modern Africa, which story lives on and continues to invent modern Africa, the social, political, and economic institutions of modern Africa, resulting in the imagination and thus the reality of Africa as a perpetually disabled, deficient, and violent continent. So I locate the ethnic, religious, and ecological forms of violence that I study within the story of Africa's unique modernity. Doing so is what makes clear that ethnic, religious, and ecological violence do not constitute three separate forms of violence, but they are echoes of the same crisis of belonging. But my interest is theological. Can Christian theology illumine Africa's crisis of belonging? Can Christianity in Africa offer resources with which to navigate this uniquely modern crisis of belonging in non-violent ways? Can Christian identity foster new forms of community beyond ethnic belonging? Can Christian praxis engender non-violence agency and new economic and ecological possibilities in modern Africa? Can it invent a new future in Africa? This is what I am looking for. This is what took me to Benin in West Africa, to the Central African Republic, to Uganda and to Rwanda, to study select Christian activists and their communities. Using a form of ethnography, a unique method that I describe as theological portraiture, I capture their stories and document their agency, while all along listening for a story. Listening for the story of how God's love is able to invent new identities and new social and economic processes in history. That is how I wrote the book. 3. What have I learned in the process of writing this book? Wow, so many things that I've learned in the process of writing this book. But let me just briefly mention 3 key lessons. First, that a crisis of identity, a crisis of belonging, does indeed lie at the heart of modern Africa and explains so much of the violence that we witness in modern Africa. Overcoming or negotiating this crisis in non-violent ways requires a new mindset, a new outlook, a new imagination, which, as Nzamujo says, is a new way of looking at ourselves, the world, and others, and another way of locating ourselves in the world, placing ourselves in the world. Christian identity can be this new way of looking at ourselves, the world, and others, and of placing ourselves in the world. Or rather, since Christian identity is a gift, it is another way of being placed in the world. However, Christian identity, just like any other identity, is not a static thing, an essence or a metaphysical, biological essence. It is a journey. Thus, the placement in the world is at the same time an invitation to a journey of constant crossing of boundaries and of negotiating different identities and commitments, and of constantly leaning forward into a new future of an ever expanding sense of my people. Secondly, the new mindset or imagination is at the same time a spirituality. All the Christian activists I study in Who Are My People, in speaking about their agency in the context of violence, they do so not so much in terms of a program, but as a simple message or a spirituality. For them, however, spirituality is not a free-floating realm. It's not a private or inner sentiment that is disconnected from the material processes of everyday life. For them, the simple message, the spirituality, is at the same time an engagement, a rich engagement which opens up a variety of alternatives and a range of practical and social possibilities. In other words, the spirituality is at the same time a form of politics. It is here that one can speak not about the spirituality of politics, but the politics of spirituality. Thirdly, the late Archbishop of Bukavu, Emmanuel Katongole, is invoking this politics of spirituality and its apparent contradictory logic of simple and excess, simplicity and excess, when in the year 2000, at the height of the war in the Congo, he writes a pastoral letter from exile to his Christians in Bukavu. In the pastoral letter, he reminds the beleaguered Christians, quote, "The logic of the gospel is not the logic of power, but the cross," end of quote. Throughout Who Are My People, I am trying to trace this logic, this spirituality, this simple message of God's self-sacrificing love in the midst of Africa's ethnic, religious, and ecological violence. I'm trying to display the rich forms of praxis it generates, the rich forms of praxis it invents. For in the end, it is this simple message that is the response to the violence in Africa, indeed the violence in the world. For as Archbishop Katongole reminds the Christians, I quote, "The only response to the excess of evil is the excess of love." A final observation. No, Ibrahim is looking at me. I'm
engaged.
You're engaged. Okay, good. Yeah. The final observation. Who Are My People was conceived as a response to the question that was first put to me. Why do you kill your own people? In the process of working on the book, I have come to see more clearly that good academic and theoretical engagement, the kind of work that I undertake in Who Are My People, is very necessary, is very important, is needful. However, even such a good theoretical work contributes only marginally to the disruption of violence. A full response to the reality of violence in Africa, indeed in the world, also calls for practical commitments and interventions. These practical commitments and engagements engage what Anthony Appiah described as the dialectics of need. He writes, every time I read another report in the newspapers of African disaster, a famine in Ethiopia, a war in Namibia, ethnic conflict in Burundi, I wonder how much good it does to correct the theories with which these evils are bound up. The solution is food, mediation, or some other material, more practical step. End of quote. For this reason, Who Are My People? As I said, a good theoretical argument, needed, presses and points the direction of more practical engagement. In this way, Who Are My People presses and points to my work with the Bethany Land Institute in Uganda. Here, I work with young people in the rural communities of Luwero to address the violence of poverty, ecological degradation, and food insecurity. Who Are My People? Bethany Land Institute, BLI, are but two complementary attempts to respond to the crisis of belonging within Africa's unique modernity. Finally, Who Are My People is dedicated to my late mother, Magdalena, who passed away on January 6, 2019, at the age of 93. She was born today, October 25th, 1925. Today would be her 97th birthday. That I'm launching the book on her birthday fills me with immense gratitude for the gift of her life and her ongoing motherly influence. It also reminds me that who I am, my identity, indeed the journey that has brought me from Malube, the place where I have come to claim so many beyond the limits of geography, religion, race, color, ethnicity, and nationality as my people, confirms that indeed identity has been and continues to be a gift. But that is the way through which God's love uses the gift and journey of identity to create, indeed to invent a new we. That is what gives us hope in the midst of so much violence in the world. Thank you all for being here. Wish you a lovely evening. Thank you.
Our speakers have already been introduced. Just to repeat the order, and before I do so, just to let you all know that the speakers note that today's event has been recorded, and towards the end, I will also mention our other co-sponsors, and thanks to our participants. And now I invite Professor Cecilia Lynch for your comments. Please welcome.
Thank you. This is a deeply beautiful book. And I want to thank Emmanuel for writing it and for inviting me here to see my friends and to be with all of you. I also want to thank Dania Strong, who's amazing as always, and Notre Dame and the Kroc Institute and Keough School. So thank you all. Emmanuel shows us in this book how doing theology is an intensely personal, but also communal and also spiritual endeavor. That it is a journey, that it weaves our own story, and it enables us to listen to the stories of others. This is a narrative, introspective methodology, which he calls theological portraiture. There are three driving lenses through which violence in Africa tends to be understood, Emmanuel argues. Ethnicity, often referred to as tribe. I would agree with him in disliking the word tribe. Religion and land. And the book addresses these in that order. The book is extraordinarily sensitive for a book by a theologian to many of the deeply influential debates that I have heard and read across the continent of Africa as a white Westerner from Missouri, from independence to the present. So these debates, what comes first, being Christian or Muslim or being African? What is each of these anyway? What was the European colonial role in creating, transforming African identity? What responsibility does that play today? What is the role in forging African modernity? By the way, I do obviously recommend the book, and I think Emmanuel's definition of African modernity is probably the best I've seen so far. It's one we talked about in our Contending Modernities group that I'm privileged to be part of. So these questions are all crucial because the dehumanizing legacies left by the British, French, Belgian, and Portuguese colonists are relatively recent, actually, compared to other parts of the world, as well as the ongoing legacies of the dehumanizing post-colonial, what I would call neoliberal abuses perpetuated by both former colonial powers and their agents, and along with many African governments, not all, but many. So regarding the first question, what comes first, Emmanuel's own story acknowledges both his Christianity and his Africanness. As a theologian, I would say he privileges his Christianity and Catholicism, although his story is one that is beautifully interreligious and transnational. It was a Muslim friend who funded his seminary education, for example. And his story is beautifully transnational in that his parents are from Rwanda, which is why but he feels more Ugandan and transnational in numerous ways. So his story is one of connection to the soil, his village in Uganda, his parents' farm, and that becomes significant in the chapter on ecological wholeness, as well as numerous other identities. And he shows us what being an African Christian in these contexts means. For him, being a Christian is a journey. It is also, in Virgilio Elizondo's words, being a mestizo, right? So his own background and his drawing on biblical identities from early Christianity shows him that being Christian is being a resident alien, always being a resident alien. This acceptance allows the journey to flourish. And it also allows the possibility of this new creation of a new weave, the invention of love, God's self-sacrificing love, over and against violence. So as he said, running through the entire book is the question posed in Belgium by an Indian colleague in 1994. Why are you Africans always killing each other? Well, I am not African, but I have had the privilege of working with colleagues across Africa for about 10 or a dozen years now, including both in Contending Modernities and in the critical investigations into humanitarianism in Africa blog. And as I said to Emmanuel earlier today in the graduate class, I reject the premise of that question. I'm going to come back to that later. The idea that I reject is that Africans are always killing each other any more than humans of any other identities, even though that is continually put on Africa and Africans. So I'm going to come back to that point. But for the moment, I just want to note that for me, rejecting the premise of that question widens the audience for Emmanuel's wisdom to the whole world, including me, including all of us in the US, including beyond Africa. And I think that's critical. So second, arising from my own interactions and experiences, I want to respond somewhat in kind to the autobiographical component of Emmanuel's very deeply felt work. So whereas Emmanuel shows us how his African identity is extremely plural, it is Ugandan and Rwandan, it is Tutsi and Hutu, it is Ugandan, it is many other things, it is Christian, and how his Christian identities and the stories of other African Christians give meaning to him in ways that transcend or offer hope for inventing the new we he articulates as critical for overcoming violence. As a US Christian, grown up Irish Catholic in Missouri, I, on the other hand, feel somewhat cheated of my more rooted identity, which is always asked of you. What is your tribe? What is your ethnicity, et cetera? So in thinking more about indigenous identities, Celtic spirituality, et cetera, I feel somewhat cheated of that. And I realized that over the past few years, I've been reading novels and poetry by Irish authors and African authors. And it's an interesting combination. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o says, Ireland was Britain's first colony, and Britain used a lot of the same methods in its colonies in Africa. So I feel a little bit cheated. And so you'll hear that feeling in my comments. Because of course you want me not only to love your book, which I absolutely do, but you want me to be provocative. So that's what I'm here for, right? So this feeling then happens in the face of a lot of traveling, as I mentioned, across Africa, interconnections with colleagues, also in the face of the recovery of indigeneity in the US and elsewhere in the world. This recovery is extremely present in California and in the Southwest right now. Debates about the role of Junipero Serra in the Nixon era, et cetera. And a few years ago, I was in Finland as a Fulbright scholar. It's also very prevalent in the Nordic countries, notions of indigeneity in the Arctic, the Sami peoples, for example. So the challenge of recovery is different for me. And it is a recovery of other knowledge, cosmologies, and what is becoming known as onto-epistemologies. And so I think this is also why I'm so fascinated by African religious traditions. And in my own research, I generally ask about that. And I've met healers in many parts of the continent as well. So this made me wonder how the book might read if it began with the chapter on the ecological crisis experienced in Africa today, and then moved into the categories of religion and ethnicity. Of course, this ecological crisis is happening not only across the African continent. We in California have no water left, literally. We're just about out of water. And all the deals made with big agriculture in different states in the West are now having to be renegotiated. And the folks in Beverly Hills are only now, I think, beginning to realize that, yes, they really do have to use less water, just like the rest of us. So, you know, that's pretty huge, really. Everyone knows then about the environmental crises besetting us as Africans, as Californians, as people of the world, but who really knows these things in terms of not only acting on them now, but having acted on them and having respected them for generations? And I think the response there is indigenous peoples around the world. Indigenous peoples is not often a term, I have found anyway, used in Africa, although it's becoming used more in relation to, in the context of ecological issues. So does the creation of the new we that Emmanuel discusses rely only or even primarily on our multiplicity of identities, on our acknowledgement of that? Or might it also be profitable to see it as a rerouting in the soil, as he discusses in chapter 5, not in a romantic sense and not in an exclusive community sense, but in a sense of learning from indigenous onto epistemologies and cosmologies, ways of knowing and being together for our purpose in creation. So he articulates and discusses a cosmology of interconnectedness that he draws on Pope Francis for in Laudato Si, which is beautiful. The interconnections not only among humans, but among humans and non-humans, animals and plants, rocks and soil, the earth itself. But this has long been promoted by American indigenous peoples. I saw a beautiful exhibit of an indigenous artist in the Palm Springs Museum a few years ago, just before COVID. And there was a traffic sign that said in Achumpong, the Achumpong language, and in English, "The earth is alive." And it just really makes you think. I've used that photo that I took in teaching. So Emmanuel instantiates this kind of cosmology in the book, drawing on his Christian interlocutors as well as Pope Francis. But as he acknowledges, using other African theologians, there's a connection to God in Africa that has long been important across the continent, that predates the missionaries and the expansion of Islam across the continent as well. And this is true for all post-colonial societies. As Indian theologian Christopher Durasang quotes Korean theologian Hyung-Yum Kak says, "I do not believe in an invalid God who was carried piggyback to Korea by some missionary. God was already active in history long before." And I think that that is something to remember. So Durasang thus prioritizes spirit as a way of connection between Christianity and indigeneity. And I've been sort of, as my education continues to progress, one of the things that I've discovered is this notion of animism, et cetera, tends to be quite false, and that in many African religions, and perhaps not all, but there is a central spirit, a central God. And I think that is the case in many indigenous religions, not all, of course. So for him, for Durasang, Christian purpose and mission becomes a way of being in the spirit. And I think African feminist theologians and scholars, Isabel Fury, Musa Dube, many others, also note their kind of rootedness in African spirituality and religion, as well as Christianity. And they also connect the fact that many women are healers. Fury talks about Sangomas in South Africa, for example, and how their knowledge has been devalued. So I noticed a bit of a tension in the book's discussion of indigeneity, and I just want to bring that forth because it's something that I'm struggling with as well. There's a notion in the chapter on Central African Republic that spiritual insecurity, which you take from another scholar, another theologian, prompts the resort to magical thinking, the use of fetishes and things like that. So there's a huge respect for African indigenous spirituality on the one hand, in terms of ecological wholeness. On the other hand, there's a critique of fetishism, or a questioning of fetishism. And you know, I'm someone who carries my little rosary everywhere. And, you know, what is the difference, really? It's very meaningful to me, but it caused me to question what is the difference. And there's a movement of reclamation of African objects, African cultural heritage. The Duke scholar, formerly of Gaston Berger in Senegal, Felwine Sarr, did a report for the French government of reclamation of African objects, and really goes into this question of, you know, the fact that a lot of these would be considered, he doesn't really discuss them as fetishes, but these things that we consider fetishes are also objects infused with beauty and spirituality. And so one of the things that he asks is, what happens when they're violently taken? And there's a village in Benin, for example, where that still recalls all these objects that were sacred to them being taken in the 1890s. They remember this. There's another community of Mali who accepted objects back and resacralized them and then desacralized them so they could then be put in a museum. So there's this interesting infusion of spirituality that I think we've only begun to probe. And I could discuss that more. There's also the notion of what if there's these kinds of things reclaimed, recirculate on the African continent, things that have been in European and US museums for so many years, including bones of people and sacred, remains of people. So reading this chapter right after the theoretical chapter, where, one of the beauties of this book is that Emmanuel takes on the challenges by Valentin Madimbe, Ali Mazrui, Mahmoud Mamdani, and many others, very seriously, folks who are strongly critical of the European colonial experience and the creation or invention, as Madimbe talks about, of African identity, right? But I wonder if we should also think about more specifically the role of Catholicism and Christianity in supporting different kinds of slavery, in the Industrial Revolution, in the taking of dominion over land. I wonder if what Ngugi talks about as dismemberment and the need to recover memory of how Africans make things, how Africans do things themselves, reading Emmanuel's powerful book makes me ask, do we need more of a recognition of these wounds on the part of Christians as well as Europeans and USers in order to move forward to the new we? I would say I think we do, after seeing chapels on top of dungeons in slave forts in Ghana. Some Christian denominations are now renouncing the doctrine of discovery applied to the US and many other parts of the world. And I would say that we need to think more about this question of recovery, memory and recovery, and recognition, reclamation, and reparations. So I'll close in a moment. Emmanuel helps us see how Christian spirituality, Christian languages of Dominicanism and other orders can link us to a more holistic sense of our identity. I would ask, can really digging into other spiritualities, indigenous spiritualities especially, do so as well. A rerouting, a rediscovery, a very deep rediscovery of these onto epistemologies. I don't have time to go into Emmanuel's important discussion of suffering and sacrifice, which I think is super interesting and important. But back to the notion of Africans always killing each other, especially because of ethnicity or because of religion. What about Europeans throughout the 20th century? What about Europeans today? What about the US Civil War was the most violent up until that time? And what about the threat of civil war that many of us, at least I, definitely feel today? What about the Latin American civil wars? What about the Vietnamese war, the Vietnam War? What about the Korean War? What about, that doesn't even take into account the proxy wars, right? Or the ongoing multinational extraction enabled by African as well as European governments and the US and Canada, as well as neoliberal developmentalism advanced by many NGOs and donors. So Emmanuel has a great critique of these things. I would, as a political scientist, foreground them even more, I think. Again, I think that rejecting the premise of Africans always killing each other more than other people doing so does not render Emmanuel's wisdom of the book less powerful. In fact, it makes it more powerful in that it requires us all to take seriously the question, who are my people? And to find that identity is deep and spirituality are deeply imbricated in each other for all of us, and that our journeys to discovery and rediscovery take effort and sacrifice. But I would also argue that the journey toward change cannot forget the past, acknowledging its horrors and actively opposing its ongoing manifestations, as well as recovering its cosmologies and onto epistemologies of wholeness. And I think those are also necessary to help us heal the wounds of the earth and our bodies that you so well evoke and tell us how to do. So thank you again for writing the book.
Thank you. Please do chalk up your questions. If you will have some question time, it's now my pleasure to invite Professor Todd Whitmore.
Thank you. Reading Emmanuel Katongole's "Who Are My People" was like listening to a longtime friend, and that it was. It is a lucid, beautifully written book. And I joined Cecilia in rejecting the premise of the question about Africans killing. Americans kill, we just kill from a distance, and mostly have others do it for us. I will focus my response on the question of genre. Just what genre, or rather mix of genres, is Who Are My People? There's an early gesture in the book towards being a genre of qualitative social science, towards more specifically qualitative sociology or cultural anthropology. A side note, I don't have a dog in the fight about whether qualitative sociology or cultural anthropology is actually a science. That depends on what you call a science. It's a term of convenience for me right now. It is possible, in my judgment, to be at the same time a theologian and a cultural anthropologist or qualitative sociologist, to mix the two constellations of genres without loss of either. So the gesture towards these disciplines caught my attention. Emmanuel, if I may, refers early on to the decision to do ethnographic work. In the conclusion, he refers to his work as, quote, a unique blend of analysis and ethnography, unquote. But if by ethnography one means what is most often meant in cultural anthropology, extended time spent on the ground with the subjects of research, engaging in participant observation supplemented by other field methods, then in Who Are My People, we seem to have something somewhat else. The anthropologist Alka Shaw articulates the most common understanding of participant observation. Quote, duration is important because it takes a long time to become a part of people's lives. Participant observation, it is typically suggested, should be conducted over at least a year, preferably living with the people one is studying, unquote. Now there's payoff for such work, the upending of our theoretical presuppositions. In the Shaw's words, quote, participant observation is potentially revolutionary because it forces one to question one's theoretical presuppositions about the world by an intimate, long-term engagement with and participation in the lives of strangers. Now, with the exception of a mention of a two-week trip to Central African American Republic, and I know you went there much more, there's little indication of duration in the three countries, CER, Rwanda, and Benin, featured most in Who Are My People. So it's hard to know. More, the book is structured such that the theoretical work is set up in the first two chapters before the display of time in the field in the following three chapters. So it is difficult to get a sense of a disruption of theoretical presuppositions. Emmanuel also refers to extensive interviews and structured conversations and cites the influence of Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's method of portraiture. However, after this one brief citing on page 7, there is not another mention of Lawrence Lightfoot or even of portraiture until there is again a brief mention in the conclusion. Now, there are extensive debates about the genre of the interview. What form should it take? How many are necessary for purposes of rigor? Such that the standard part of that research genre is for the author to state what kind and how many interviews she conducted. There are a few such genre markers in Who Are My People. In one instance in the book that does pay attention to interview method, Emmanuel, like with ethnography, uses a key term in a way not used by social scientists. He states that he, quote, conducted a random series of interviews, unquote, in slums on the outskirts of Kampala, but it's evident that the selection of interviewees was quite different from what is meant by random sampling in social science procedure. My point about the use of terms like ethnography and random is not that the fieldwork in Who Are My People does not have value. On the contrary, in a moment, I'll argue just the opposite. And the book is far more than anecdotal. But the terms and methods theologians use to describe our work are important in part because one of the criticisms made of theologians claiming to do some form of social scientific inquiry is that our work lacks adequate accountability to the claims we make, and thus is quote unquote thin methodologically and substantively. And the term thin is the word social scientists use to swear at each other. There will likely always be social scientists who reject as a matter of principle theological modes of reasoning. But if theologians want to be in conversation, as also scholars doing social science with qualitative sociologists and cultural anthropologists, then we need to use their terms in ways recognizable to at least those among them who do not rule theological modes of reflection out of court a priori. Now, given the number of times Emmanuel uses the term story or narrative, my informal count is that the words appear on 33 pages, with as many as 11 mentions on a page. We might expect some engagement with narrative sociology and anthropology, but there's no such engagement in Who Are My People? Now, more important than even the number of or kind of interviews or which social scientists Emmanuel engages is the place of narrative in Who Are My People? It is at the opposite end of the research project from that in qualitative sociology or cultural anthropology. In Who Are My People, the specification of the Christian account comes in the second chapter, subtitled The Journey of Christian Identity. It is only in the chapters that follow that Emmanuel displays specific instances of living the narrative, that narrative in context of violence. In Lawrence Lightfoot and Jessica Hoffman Davis's The Art and Science of Portraiture, the turn to building of narrative comes in the last chapter, quoting them, composing the narrative is the last and most comprehensive feature of portraiture. In other words, for qualitative sociologists, the ultimately definitive narrative for a study is retrospective. This does not mean that a researcher does not bring theories or narratives to the field. One can't help but do so. All qualitative researchers that I know reject any idea of observational neutrality as a chimera. But the aim is to hold such theories and narratives lightly enough that they can be fundamentally challenged and even changed. And this goes even for whatever ultimate convictions the researcher might have, Christian or otherwise. So to be clear, for a researcher to do both Christian theology and qualitative social science accountedly is to necessarily risk that she will convert to a different, that is, other than Christian, way of construing God in the world by the end of the study. There's no way around this possibility. Whatever narrative that the qualitative researcher constructs in grant proposals is subject to radical alterations such that the final framing narrative can have to be drastically different from the first one. This is particularly the case in the more immersive forms of qualitative inquiry, and is Alpha Shah's point. The structure of Who Are My People indicates that the framing narrative used to interpret events is and remains prospective. It is formulated in the early, more theoretical chapters, the later chapters constituting a search for illustrations or instantiations to populate it. In other words, from a qualitative sociological perspective, but in a way that makes sense, and bear with me here, in a particular kind of theology, Who Are My People is unapologetically confirmation biased. Its primary aim is to seek confirmation of the Christian story. Thus, at the end of the second theoretical chapter, where he works out what it means to be Christian, narrated as accepting God's invitation to self-sacrificing love, or later the logic of the cross, and just before the field chapters, Emmanuel writes, but what does God's self-sacrificing love look like? And the ensuing chapters provide illustrations or instantiations. Here, one or two or three instantiations is sufficient. And from a particular kind of theological perspective, this approach makes perfect sense. The Christian story is that God has redeemed forever the world and has promised both that the redemption will come to full realization and that in the meantime, the presence of the Holy Spirit will assure that there will be at least some contemporary instantiations of it. The Christian hope and faith is a prospective faith and hope. In a world where Reinhold Niebuhr can say the doctrine of original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian faith, it makes theological sense to search for and lift up counterfactuals, even if this establishes the ultimate narrative construction at the opposite end of research, as does the qualitative sociologist. Emmanuel writes, throughout my time in CER, the question of hope was foremost on my mind. What visible signs of hope might there be in the aftermath of the Seleka and Antibolica violence? Pre-narrated prospective hope turns what would be a vice in social science, confirmation bias, into a virtue. There does not need to be a preponderant number of positive cases for there to be hope. Read this way, Who Are My People is a kind of Lives of the Contemporary Saints. In my reading then, the fundamental aim and primary achievement of the book is to offer empirical, yes, empirical grounds for hope. And in this, it succeeds tremendously. In a world full of violence and rhino nevers, this is no small accomplishment. So if it's not qualitative sociology or cultural anthropology, what are the deep influences that play in Who Are My People? As I said, the term story and narrative appear frequently, and they're central to the theology of Stanley Hauerwas. Emmanuel's first book made the case for Hauerwas's theology, and the influence clearly remains. Emmanuel states, quote, through Hauerwas's work, I had already come to appreciate the role that stories play in shaping individual and communal identities, unquote. So for lack of a specific genre, we could just call this theology in the Hauerwasian tradition. But Who Are My People moves beyond Hauerwas in important ways. Hauerwas refers to Christians as resident aliens, meaning that they are fundamentally different from those around them. Hauerwas therefore argues that different religions, quote, this is Hauerwas, produce fundamentally different experiences of what it is to be human, unquote. However, Emmanuel writes in the first, more theoretical part of the book, quote, we never have or are one identity. Christian life and identity cannot be, but be a life of constant negotiation and boundary crossing. And he displays his claim clearly in the second part of the book, where sometimes particular Muslims serve as exemplars of faith. By the way, this is very biblical. Jesus often refers to people not of the nation of Israel as exemplars of faith. Instead of Hauerwas, they influence the Muslims influence Christians and vice versa. Instead of Hauerwas, Emmanuel turns to Virgilio Elizondo's understanding of Christian identity as mestizo, where in Elizondo's words, I am always both kin at home and foreigner at the same time. And I think this would be very different than the resident alien idea. This is quite different, as I say, than that of the resident alien. It offers greater complexity in its accounts and leavens the book as a whole. Thus, the second important contribution of Who Are My People is that it moves narrative theological ethics beyond the work of Stanley Hauerwas. Emmanuel illustrates his first appeal to life as a constant negotiation and boundary crossing by reference to his own life story. And this leads me to my final genre observation and conclusion. Threaded throughout the book, in both the early, more theoretical chapters and the later chapters that display the theory, are autobiographical vignettes and personal life overviews. Taken as a whole, these vignettes and overviews begin with Emmanuel's childhood in Uganda as a son of a Hutu mother and a Tutsi father, extend through his graduate studies in Belgium, where he witnessed in befuddlement through television the Rwandan genocide, and lead finally up to his recent trips to Rwanda, the Central African Republic, and Benin. The writing here is among the most elegant in an elegantly written book, and is where we get the best sense of what Shaw would call duration. Though there's not enough in the autobiographical moments to call the book an autobiography or an autoethnography, there's enough to say that there are elements, at the very least, of the theological genre of the confession. In the tradition of Augustine and Dorothy Day, the confession places the author in the center of the story, not to convey primarily the self, but through the self, the world and the God who made it. And the confession as a genre is a form of retrospective narrative, a looking back on a life of change, of conversion. This book's overall structure, with the ultimate theoretical framing presented as preceding the time in the field then, can be misleading and perhaps does not do the author justice. Who Are My People may not be retrospective in the way that qualitative sociology seeks to be, but significant aspects of it are retrospective nonetheless. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd, and my pleasure to invite Jason Springs.
Thank you.
And thank you, Emmanuel, for including me in the conversation. Quite an honor. Congratulations. And who are my people? Emmanuel lays out how possibilities for transformation begin in the gathering of people into communities, small scale though they may be. It's here that love positions itself in contrast to its diametric opposite, that of power. Emmanuel names the power of the Western state interlopers, the developed nation underwritten development agencies and development community, and the power of the successor of the colonial power's presence, the African states. The communities in question are born of the sacrificial suffering love of Jesus. Emmanuel conveys the genesis of these through the theological portraitures he sets forth throughout the book. In these ways, Emmanuel's book strikes me as an exercise in narrative theology that complements the work of another African ethicist and religious thinker, Charles Villavicencio, and specifically his book of 10 years ago entitled Walk with Us and Listen. I'll briefly place the two books in juxtaposition in order to bring the ethical significance of Emmanuel's into further relief. At the heart of Villavicencio's book was the instruction to would-be do-gooders and global crusaders from the US, European Union, the international community of political and economic elites, and international NGO community to do just that. Walk with us and listen. At the time, Villavicencio described himself as partaking in the practice of frank and fearless speech. This purpose referred to Michel Foucault's posthumously published lectures examining the ancient Greek concept of parrhesia, or the practices of truth-telling, and the cultivated formation of those who are truth-tellers, examining, quote, who is able to tell the truth about what, with what consequences, and with what relations to power. With the question of the importance of telling the truth, knowing who is able to tell the truth, and knowing why we should tell the truth, we have the roots of what we would call the critical tradition in the West, Foucault wrote. At one level, the poetic upshot of Villavicencio's exercise of frank and fearless speech was to say this: walk with us and listen. Or translated into the ethical terms that infuse the title of that book, learn and practice the art of accompaniment. Accompany us, walk alongside. Do not come to us to give us answers or to rescue us. We already know what we need. Enter into a relationship of mutuality with us. Open yourselves to the possibility that you will learn something that actually affects who you are and what you do, and make some meaningful difference, some meaningful change to who you are, and thus how you understand and go about your efforts to aid others, to reduce suffering, to meet needs, and assist communities and societies invested in liberating and transforming themselves. And so any proposed aid or assistance or support from the international development or NGO communities must pass, Villavicencio said, through the eye of the needle of the local. We might say it must pass through principles and practices of subsidiarity, but construing these as a kind of brook of fire that smelts away impurities like the hubris of pity or the rescuing mentality of a savior complex. In reading through Emmanuel's book, I find that it opens up in a lengthy and reflective way precisely the kind of spaces and occasions for encounter that Villavicencio called for. That is, it opens up opportunities for readers outside these African contexts, readers in seminaries and universities and schools of global development, in church and religious communities across the US, but elsewhere as well, to listen and follow along, to assume a posture of teachability. Teachability in the deep and formative sense of another Greek concept, that of paideia. This is not listening that seeks instruction for instrumental purposes so one can better implement the technocratic expertise one is garnering in policy and rendering development services so that, for example, I can integratively solve your problem. This is teachability that impacts who one is, what one is becoming, and how one sees and interacts with the world. Emmanuel's book opens occasions for the kind of listening and for this kind of listening and teachability, and this kind of walking alongside an accompaniment that impacts who we, his readers, are, and what we are becoming at multiple levels, including, and perhaps most importantly, in a context like the Keough School of Global Affairs, what we are becoming as teachers, researchers, and reflective practitioners oriented toward global development, and certainly any development that would purport to be in any way integrally human. Emmanuel gives us this as textured portraiture born of, interwoven throughout with, theological reflection. Interestingly and consistent with Villavicenzio's effort is what I see as Emmanuel's work to engage in frank and fearless speech, a work of truth-telling. And Emmanuel tells his readers that rather than setting forth these stories in any neutral sense, the book is born of his conviction that the truth of a story, of these stories, is judged by the reality they create and the lives they shape. This aims to speak back to many audiences who most likely are in some way, at some level, captivated by, held captive to, the rejective myth about Africa, though they may not be aware of that. Indeed, I would say that that myth is so pervasive that if we're not actively interrogating our thinking and presuppositions for traces of it, it's probably operative to some degree and at some level in the background, and maybe so nonetheless. Moreover, the book opens these spaces for encountering these truthful stories and their effect by, as Emmanuel says, showing the possibility, indeed the reality, of an alternative, a nonviolent Africa, one shaped by the story of God's self-sacrificing love. Intriguingly, this central purpose and function of the book fits naturally with theology as an exercise of parousia, the sustained exercise in the practices of truth-telling. That's what we have here in my judgment. The work really is in the spirit of critical theory that Foucault describes in his exposition of frank and fearless speech as a practice of truth-telling, but a critical narrative theology. Of course, Foucault saw the endpoint of such an enterprise as the exposition of power, whereas Emmanuel counters this by bringing his readers to an endpoint of love. So consider, for example, Emmanuel's concept of the violence of love. The phrase does not mince words. We have here an instance of frank, fearless speaking as a component of the practices of truth-telling, if ever there was, the violence of love. The concept emerges as a logical extension of the portraiture of Christian activists throughout the book who are acting against, quote, the devaluation and wanton sacrifice of African lives. They discover that healing from, quote, the burden of Africa's history entails suffering the violence of love, in which the activists discover, embrace, and orient their work by the self-sacrificing love of God, which has the transformational effect of leading them to self-sacrificing love. This heals their own suffering. But Emmanuel explains, it also liberates them to invent new communities and practices through which they seek to heal, restore, and renew God's love for other victims of violence. In the afterword that follows, the conclusion, Emmanuel details some of the practices of community that embody and facilitate this transformation. Practices like working in the fields together to grow crops, and eating together, worshiping together as a vision of reconciliation through the cross, celebrating feast days and wedding ceremonies together, building up friendships that can heal and transform the kinds of divisions and divisiveness that have been inflicted by Africa's modernity. With this, Emmanuel intentionally sidesteps prescriptive social ethics, and even as he anticipates some claiming, quote, the task of Christian social responsibility, in his refusal to push this analysis through to claims about how to make Africa more peaceful and more democratic. Emmanuel says instead, and rightly in my judgment, that he's working in a different kind of politics, in that he is on one hand refusing to deal with politics in relation to state power, and instead engaging in politics understood as the ordering of bodies in space and time. This is the politics of love. As he quotes the former Archbishop of Bukavu, the only response to the excess of evil is the excess of love. And further, the logic of the gospel is not a logic of power, but of the cross. As far as this goes, I find myself persuaded. I do wonder if it's not possible, perhaps necessary, to push just a bit further. I wonder if to end at this point and embrace the politics of an excess of love as, in effect, one horn of an apparent dilemma between the politics of love and the politics of social responsibility may tempt unwitting readers toward a kind of ethical and political quietism. That is, a quietism that risks refusing questions of Christian social responsibility altogether in virtue of a totalizingly different conception of the politics of love. I wonder if the standing opposition of love and power may leave their untransformed essences intact, or at least leave the essence of power intact. The logic of the cross does not reject power, it transforms it. Just like it transforms love as we humans know it and practice it. The exclusion of power in its untransformed version, ironically, therefore, leaves a third term occluded, a term that mediates love and power in virtue of the transformation of both terms by the logic of the cross. In the portraitures that Professor Katongole offers us, I read this third term as present. I sense it hovering over his exposition of the violence of love and suffering. It's not explicitly spoken there. That tripart mediating term is justice. Allow me to clarify by way of an example. The opposition of power and love by the former Archbishop of Bakuva brought to my mind a pivotal point in the narrative arc of a class I teach, a class entitled, quite appropriately, Love and Violence. The class traces the impact of and resistance to French colonialism in Algeria, the impact of and resistance to British colonialism in India, and the influence of both of these resistance movements upon the resistances marshaled by the civil rights movement in the US. In particular, I'm reminded of the moment when Martin Luther King Jr., with his appeal to the transformational capacity of the sacrificial love manifest through nonviolence, ran headlong into a wall of refusal by many younger civil rights activists who believed it to be simply a violence of love. The response took its most pointed opposition in the form of Stokely Carmichael's call for Black power. Power and love, Carmichael argued, were intrinsically opposed. You must choose one or the other, the violence of love or the violence of power. Carmichael vied for power. King refused the terms of the opposition. He did this textually by reading against one another theological misinterpretations of Jesus's teachings in the Gospels about love on one hand, and Friedrich Nietzsche's account of the will to power on the other. In effect, King's biblical analysis argued that the subsumption of both love and power in the agapic love at the heart of the logic of the cross transforms both, mediating them through the concept and practices of justice. He wrote, "What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best, power transformed, we might say, is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love." Now, I don't see any of this at odds with the communally embodied politics of love that Emmanuel sets before his readers as the upshot of Who Are My People? But I do think it bears making explicit, integrating and developing further. And I think this points towards future work, which I happen to know that Professor Katongole is undertaking in his new book project. So without forcing him to tip his hand as to the nature and contents of that project, I nonetheless invite his reflections now on how we might see the role of justice, the praxis of love as a praxis of justice, situated within community contexts like these, and what he has to say what it has to say and do in these and surrounding contexts. This is especially important to interloping readers like myself, who aspire to listen, to accompany, and be taught in ways that might genuinely impact and alter who we are, and how we engage with one another and our work together here and now.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Emmanuel, for your wonderful book and for eliciting these wonderful set of reflections. Contending Modernity is really honored to host this event here today. As you know, Contending Modernities cannot function without two things: persons and sponsors. The persons who work endlessly day and night after regular hours. The most important is Dania Strawn, who has supported Contending Modernity strongly in this event and all other events. Please help me to thank Dania. Dania does her work efficiently, carefully, and lovingly. And she manages all this with a family and two very young kids. So you really have my admiration. Thank you. Yeah. The other person here who works with Dania is the editor of the Contending Modernities blog. And if you haven't been to that blog, please do so. It's Josh Lupo. And Joshua is here today. And please thank him for all the work he does and on our behalf for Contending Modernities. Thank you, Josh. We have a couple of minutes before you have to enjoy the refreshment we have out there. We would like, if there are any kind of comments that the speakers want to make to each other, and then we'll entertain maybe one or two questions from the audience. And then Dean Appleby, who is here today and the founder of Contending Modernities, will invite him to say a few words in conclusion, words of thanks. So there was some question directed at you, Emmanuel. What's your next project?
There are many questions directed.
I know. So
and I'm just pondering all these questions.
Right.
I just want.
I mean, we are all your people.
Yeah. So I just want to thank the panelists for such a rich conversation, which goes in three different directions, but all rich directions, and I actually compliment, but also tease out a number of elements in the work. One of the things that I'm learning that, for which I'm grateful, that the book is able to elicit these many conversations and questions without me pretending to even know what the answer about this is. For example, the tension that Syria recognizes between indigeneity, my kind of maybe hesitations about indigeneity, affirmation on one hand, but also maybe, I don't know. Christianity's complicity in violence, a lot of that can be done. The question of justice, without any explicit, there is no explicit really discussion of justice as a topic. That could be a topic. But what I see embedded within this stories is really an actual realization or working at these notions of justice, not only in the kind of the framing that we have of justice, but in the very redefinition actually of what is just. The question is about genre. Wow. I think you nailed it. I am trying to kind of do a bit of social science research methodology, but I'm not persuaded that I should be a social scientist. As a theologian, I feel I'm already a social scientist. So how to hold that tension, I think you rightly noted. But I would be interested to follow up this notion of confession that you suggest. So I just want to hear more comments, and I'm just taking it in because of these are such a rich comment. Perhaps many of these might find a concrete expression and maybe articulation in the kind of the more practical work that I'm doing. It's not that I'm kind of really making a major distinction between theory and practice. I think it's complementary, but as I do that, I think I will reflect on these questions even more.
Thank you. Anyone in the audience like to pose a question? We got 7 minutes before we conclude. Yes, thank you.
I have a quick observation and a question. So one of the things that I'm struck by in both Todd Whitmore and Emmanuel Katongole's work is the role of ambiguity. So earlier, ambiguity. So earlier today, we were having a discussion with Emmanuel Katongole, and he said that there's hope in the ambiguity of identity. And Todd Whitmore in his work focuses on locating us in the middle of things. Yet both of you don't want to leave us just in the ambiguity. You want to maintain it, but you also try to move us forward in some way. So Todd Whitmore has 4 signposts: attention, discernment, commitment, and return. And Emmanuel uses the metaphor of a journey. And so that's my observation. You're both doing that, I think, in different ways, but you're holding both of those things together in some way. My question has to do with genre and method. So is there something about the use of narrative, confession, and Emmanuel's book also contains a sermon at the end, using those sorts of modes or ethnography that allows us to capture both ambiguity and journey, both in the middle of things in signposts and in a unique way? And another way of asking the same question would be, is there something about the way that academic theological thinking works in terms of prioritizing linear arguments and these kinds of things that leads to the erasure of certain forms of theology, thinking, these kinds of things? So just an invitation about reflecting on this sort of unique method of doing knowledge.
Sure. I began my comments actually when I began writing them up and like actually kind of comparing the processes in more detail, and I thought, no, it's your day. But I actually began not wanting, we both hold up particular exemplars of communities of Christianity, but I didn't start out with that. I was going to study microfinance in IDP camps, and found out that there was none because there wasn't enough flow of capital. There was a few years later, but not. And so I had to go study something else. And what were the people interested in? Okay, and I became interested in the question of there were these amazing acts of people willing to risk themselves on behalf of others. And I said, well, what might make sense of that? But it wasn't until 8 years after I'd done the field work that I did a series of interviews with nuns of the Indigenous Order, Little Sisters Mary Immaculate Gulu. I thought, oh, okay, that's how that links up. And then even then, when I first submitted the manuscript the first time I submitted to a publisher, they sent it back saying, we like your manuscript, we're just baffled, there's no through line. And so for me, the narrative came last. And got bounced around and these sorts of things. And so, yeah, and it doesn't mean that you don't bring theories and narratives with you in the field. You can't help but do that, right? And it doesn't mean everything's up for grabs, even for social scientists. It's not like, oh, everything's up for grabs. No, you come in with a theory and try, but it could be dislodged. And I think for me, being in the middle of things is operating with the potentiality that even your fundamental beliefs about the way the world works could be dislodged or altered fundamentally.
Yeah, that's true, definitely. They could be altered, but find ourselves in the midst of complexity. The hope is that at least we have a certain kind of compass. It may be provisional, it may change, but you've got to have a certain kind of compass or directionality of where you want to go. And identity, in my opinion, works in that way. It kind of provides a certain kind of direction, sense, anchors, a few anchors in terms of the many negotiations that are around. I am not one who kind of exhausts kind of complexity or ambiguity for its own sake. There is a set of focus, direction that constantly also changes in a way. And I think that's why I have liked this method of portraiture in terms of listening for a story. The story that at least I work with from a theological point of view is the story of God's love. And that's supposed to provide in a way certain kind of direction, certain kind of compass of where Christians' lives need to point, or what should structure Christians' life in the world, so forth. As they kind of bounce up against so many other experiences, histories, and structures that maybe bump against that expression of love. But there is a certain kind of directionality. So, I mean, that's where the sense of listening for a story, that's kind of the orienting story, without saying that this is a kind of a thing or a fixed point. That's how I understand the whole question of this narrative and this story that I'm trying to listen to and see how it expresses himself, or how it is negotiated, how it is embodied by all these different exemplars that I studied.
Thank you, Emmanuel, and thank you to our to the speakers. What a great day this is! The birthday of your mother, the presence of your brother, and great colleagues celebrating your work and commenting on it. It's my great pleasure to call upon the Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs, my colleague Scott Appleby, to give the closing remarks.
Just very quickly to thank Ibrahim, thank you for hosting. Thanks to Danya and to Josh. We thank them, but it's always worth thanking them again. And of course, Emmanuel, thank you for writing this wonderful book. However, I would like to focus my thanks on the respondents and say something 30 seconds about each one of them. And I begin by requesting, demanding, cajoling that you send the comments, at least if you would. Why? Because they were illuminating through your commentary on Emmanuel's book of, as I listened, key debates and concerns that we have first in the Continuing Modernities Project. I'm going to mention Cecilia in that respect, her comment. Also in the Keough School, and it's something Jason said, I'll repeat quickly, and larger in the academy that Todd focused on. In terms of Cecilia's comments and Continuing Modernities, of course, Emmanuel, being a leader of the Continuing Modernities Project, you talked about African modernity, and Cecilia rightly raised the question, I think many of us had, and it was repeated, what's so special about Africa in terms of the terrible violence? And I think I come away, I'm not sure that you would endorse this, but you can tell us in the break, since I don't want to take much time. If the answer isn't, well, it's not so much the intensity or the brutality, which can be compared to the Civil War, to other parts of the world. It is, why do we kill one another? It's because the colonists taught us to. Or to nuance that, the colonists separated us in such a way, it imposed upon us certain kinds of identities that pitted us against one another. I don't know that that's the answer, but certainly there the comparison would be perhaps to India, in which the colonial presence intentionally segregated, intentionally sponsored violence against the other. I don't, in saying that, want to romanticize the pre-colonial presence as if it was just a wonderful Garden of Eden in either Africa or India, but there is something to Caroline Elkin's massive tome, The Legacy of Violence, about how the colonial presence, not only of Britain, but of course it's about Britain, really sowed the seeds of a kind of violence of neighbor against neighbor in these colonial lands. So Cecilia raised that. It's a question in Continuing Modernities we asked, and this is where Emmanuel's book is so helpful, about the nature of modernities, and is there an African modernity that is particularly distinctive? And I think Emmanuel's book points us in the direction of some kind of at least provisional answer to the question. To Jason's comment, which addresses what we are always talking about and debating and keeps us going here, is a normative statement of the Keough School is integral human development. And I forget exactly how you phrased it elegantly, Jason, but it was in response to Emmanuel's methods, this narrative theology, this focus on the individual, this focus on the personal, and that you pose it against, I think it's an object lesson for us, against a kind of a technocratic approach in which the human person and the dignity of the person is the lens through which we understand and judge and evaluate any kind of technocratic or any other kind. So that's why particularly I want to steal from you. We're all in the same kind of borrowing system here in the Keele School, but I thought it had great, what you said about the book had great implications for our larger discussion of human development. And finally, to Todd, to completely channel and misuse the irascible and great and irascible making Harold Bloom on the anxiety of influence. And the reason I thought of that when you were speaking seemed like an odd connection, but that great text by Bloom, I'm using it in a different way, and what I get anxious about in these conversations is what kind of influence we have as academics in the academy. And what a wonderful book like this and a conversation like this, which we have all around here all the time. The anxiety is a little bit different the way Bloom used the concept. The anxiety is, and how do these wonderful ideas and analyses and theoretical reflections get communicated in a way that does do what I think we're all committed to, the kind of transformation, however incremental. And that's where your reflections on, which I thought were brilliant, reflections on the methods and the methods that Emmanuel kind of comes close to and maybe takes a couple steps away from. It's a both particularly personal book, and it's also Emmanuel's own as an original theologian. He has the right, apparently, theologians have the right to kind of create their own. We historians like Carol Adams actually totally empirically out, but it's hard to get one season. Your points about the different disciplinary approaches made me think about how do we, both within the academy itself, which is doesn't always have conversations like this, alongside conversations about method and disciplinary approaches and quantitative and qualitative ways of metrics, how we do better to make an impact both within our own disciplines and within the academy. But then Emmanuel pointed it out, it's only in the footnote one place in the book, in with this and the index in one place, and that is Bethany Land Institute. That's another kind of anxiety of influence in the sense of this. It is, I think you said something modest about it, Emmanuel, but having been there, it is modest in the grandest way, in that it is taking a series of ideas and concepts, Laudato Si, and really on a scalable way, trying to implement them in a kind of violence of love, violence in terms of tearing down and building up, in this case, the forest, the land. And I'll never forget, and I'll close with this, that when we were in that Mary school, and you had 20-something caretakers all dressed in their uniforms, and they were performing and singing for us, visitors, this August or this summer, which was not new to me. They've been in Uganda and in Africa several times. What was new to me was that they were singing lines from Laudato Si. Isn't that right? So they weren't just singing whatever. I thought, what kind of indoctrination can they do? These young people are singing the Katongole hymn. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.